we've heard from Pete Hegseth and Mike O'Hanlon, so I'll let them sit here quietly for a minute and listen to our three new entrants to the discussion. And we'll just come right down the line here with Steve Bucci and then Russell Rumbaugh and then Congressman Kaufman, and give us your quick reaction or comments yourself, things that haven't been raised that should have been raised, or terrible errors that Mike O'Hanlon or Pete Hegseth have made. Feel free to call them out on that.
Actually, it's Michael and I have done these before, and we came to the conclusion that this is an issue where, strangely enough, Heritage and Brookings actually agree on a lot of things, which I think lends some credence to what we're talking about, because it's not partisan. I do want to say, though, with such an esteemed group as this, I kind of feel like the guy who came to the gunfight with nothing but a knife. But fortunately, I'm a Special Forces guy, so I'm actually pretty good with a knife. I don't feel too badly about it. I have to tell you, I joined the military a long time ago, and I saw the downturn after Vietnam and how we tried to save money from there, and then we kind of hollowed out the Army. I saw the downturn after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the changes there, and we had to build up again. After Desert Storm, we thought, oh, we're the greatest military in the world, and we were at that point, and we started to let things slip. Historically, we do this all the time, and the idea of trying to take money from defense to get a peace dividend, it hasn't worked before. And now we're doing it, and as we kind of established, at least the majority of people raise their hands when they ask, are we at war? We're trying to do it now, and we're not even done with the war. That's a problem. Now, clearly, if you cut defense, are we going to be less ready for the next overseas event that comes? Yes. I mean, Ray Charles can see that, all right? But an aspect that has not been raised here that we need to understand is, if you cut DOD more than the $1 trillion plus that have already been cut between the Gates efficiencies and the first half of the BCA, there's going to be an effect domestically as well. The Department of Defense, I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense for a couple of years, so I was DOD's plug into all the domestic stuff that they do. DOD is the responder of last resort for everything in this country. Whether it's pandemic influenza, whether it's hurricanes, any of those things, at a certain point, DOD gets a call to come and contribute. Whether it's through the National Guard, which is the biggest part of it, or directly with Title X federal forces, or even the DOD civilians, they play a role in that. They support the Department of Homeland Security. They support all the other domestically oriented agencies. And they are not going to have the discretionary funds or capabilities to do that if these additional cuts go into effect. To be honest with you, I'm not sure they have that capability today, or at least not enough of it. Bottom line is sequestration, and I think Senator Graham said this, sequestration is dumb. Right? It was bad policy. Everybody who signed it made a mistake when they signed that part of the BCA. It's just a bad way to do policy. We've got to do it better than that. And to address those, okay, a DOD guy talking now, right? I spent 30 years in DOD. Is there a lot of fat in DOD that needs to be cut? Yes. The acquisition system alone, if you could fix that, you would save so much money the average citizen's head would spin. Sequestration is not going to touch that. Right? It's going to make everybody feel good that they cut something from defense, because that seems less abhorrent than cutting it from Social Security. But it's going to have a negative effect, and it's not going to affect the efficiency of the department. So when we do this stuff, for my colleagues who say, let's just cut defense, it'll make them be more efficient. They obviously have no clue on how the Department of Defense does its business, because it won't make them more efficient. It'll just hurt their readiness. And I'll stop there and let us go to my brethren here, and then we'll pick it up in the discussion.
Thanks, Steve. Russell?
Well, thanks for having me here. And I think there's 2 points that haven't been brought up, and I'll play off Steve a little bit. One, let's talk about the need for a lot of defense spending. We're a nation at war. We're facing a situation in Syria. If we send troops into Syria, shouldn't we spend money? What's been left out of the conversation so far is, what if you paid for it? What if you raised taxes to increase defense spending, which is what we've traditionally done. The income tax came from World War I. Korea didn't add to the debt because they flipped on all of the taxes that had been in place during World War II, but had been turned off afterwards. In 1969, at the height of the Vietnam War, we ran a budget surplus because Congress had forced a surcharge down President Johnson's throat. This has been an interesting decade where we've gone to war, spent money on war, as we should, and not asked more of the American people. Let's not forget there's another way to give, and this options of very hard choices. Then to quickly run the other way, I probably am a little more acceptant than many people here of lower defense spending, but that's because, as Steve alluded to, how we spend our dollars on defense matters too. Senator Graham said that very well, right? It's not just numbers, it's capability as well. I'd like to introduce the idea of inter-service rivalry. It's fun talking to a group of veterans. I expect all of you already have your biases. Mr. Crystal's already introduced one of the biases. Many people assume when budgets get tight, the inter-service rivalry goes up. That's actually not true. Counterintuitively, when times get tight, it gets scarier. And so the military services basically agree to not attack each other. The archetype of this is the drawdown in the 90s, where everybody came down by half, but they all got to choose how you came down. That's a great solution if you want to keep a little bit of everything, and the future's uncertain, so maybe a little bit of everything is a good idea. But if you're confident our problem is Syria, or if you're confident our problem is China, those are very different strategic choices. And we actually have military services that are well suited to one or the other, but not both. And if we're going to have that conversation, I think we could very profitably have a conversation about how to come down more specifically, keep our national security high, but lower defense spending. And with that,
Well, thanks, Russell. That's very helpful. And I should have mentioned when I was introducing Mike Hoffman before that he serves on the House Armed Services Committee, so he's actually the only person on the stage who can actually decide or help decide how money is allocated and spent, and has become a very influential member of that committee and after only 2 terms in the House. So give us a perspective from HASC, or a perspective from Congress, or just a perspective from common sense.
Well, thank you, Bill. First of all, let me say that I think that the sequester would harm national security simply because of the manner of the across-the-board nature of those cuts. But let me say that I think that we do need to reform the Department of Defense. And in doing so, we could have savings without compromising our national security. And I want to raise 3 points that haven't been discussed. And the first point is nation building, or counterinsurgency versus counterterrorism. And as an Iraq War veteran, first Gulf War veteran as well, but Iraq War veteran, I'm very proud of my service. But I think that the notion that we're going to invade, occupy, pacify, and administer whole countries is a very inefficient way of achieving our security objectives in a very costly way. And I think that we need to move back, and I think we are, to the notion of aligning ourselves within factions of a given region that share our strategic interest in achieving our security objectives. And I think Yemen and Somalia are probably a template for that versus Iraq and Afghanistan. Secondly, I think we really need to look at this 1.42 million people that we have on active duty. And we need to say, do all those functions need to be performed by active duty military personnel? Or could they be performed in the Guard and Reserve as well, without compromising national security, but being more cost effective in our approach? Look at Israel and their recent response to their problem with the Gaza Strip. They mobilized their reserves to meet that threat. And so there are clearly functions that we wouldn't want to have in the Guard and Reserve that need to be maintained on active duty, but there's a lot of things that can at a fraction of the cost. Lastly, just this administration, when it comes to contracting things that need to be done, whether products or services, has gone the route of what they call insourcing. And that is taking things that could be competitively done in the private sector, but yet bringing them in-house to be performed by public employees. In my view, at a higher cost, in a less efficient manner. A friend of mine who's still on active duty in the Marine Corps as a colonel was telling me that when he had contractors before performing certain functions, he would say, these are my deliverables, this is the date that I need it done, and this is what I'm willing to pay for it. Now he has public employees doing those same functions, and he doesn't have that leverage with them. And they will be there even when the demand disappears. That's the nature of government. And so I think that there's things I just wanted to raise issues that had not been discussed. But let's see clearly sequester is a problem. But I think we ought to see the fiscal pressures of today in a positive note that would push reform to the Department of Defense, reforms that we ought to be advocating, even if we had a balanced budget.
Let me ask you this, since you are a member of Congress and of House Armed Services. I mean, would you get a hazard a prediction about how sequester is resolved, just on the defense side, leave aside maybe the rest of it? What kind of top-line number are we looking at for FY, I guess it would be 2013, right? And then how do you see the next 2-3 years, again, in a way, regardless of what we wish? I mean, we know who the president is. We know what he has generally said. We know what the composition of Congress is for the next 2 years. What kind of budget do you think we're looking at? Do you think we have a real chance to make progress on the reforms, or are we treading water for a couple of years? What's your sense?
You know, no doubt we're going to have cuts. They're not going to be as deep as the sequester. I do worry, I have to be realistic with you, it's going to be kicking the can down the road, that it's going to be maybe something, buying time, like something that the chairman of the committee, Buck McKeon, raised to do cuts. What would be the first year cuts, but buy us a year to find a more intelligent solution as to not doing things across the board, but doing specific cuts that wouldn't compromise national security. I don't see the sequester happening as it is written right now, but it's going to be shades of gray. It's not going to be that people think that if we don't do sequester, there's not going to be cuts to defense. There will be cuts to defense, but probably more intelligently targeted and lesser in the dollar amount.
Thanks. Would you like to tell us, since you're up here and there's a lot of press here, who the next SecDef will be, or anything else that you've have you gotten a private phone call from the president on that?
No. It's not me. There we go.
Well, there's a headline, right? Mike, comments on what Steve Russell or Congressman have said? Or
I can pass for now. I just want to admire their brevity and conciseness and provocativeness. So look forward to questions from the crowd.
Yeah, you wouldn't really fit in at Brookings, but that's okay. Couldn't resist that. What do you think? Let me ask Mike a question, though. I mean, you followed this so closely for a while. Let's say, who knows what the defense budget will be. Let's assume in 2016 it gets cut a little bit, but not as much as sequester, and then it drifts downward a little more. That seems to be the way things are going, but no radical overhaul of U.S. foreign policy or of U.S. national security and defense commitments. Do you think if we're sitting here in 2016 that we will have an adequate defense budget to fulfill our basic, assuming no radical reorientation of U.S. foreign policy, which would mean not choosing, I think, between China and Syria, but being able to deter in Asia and maybe not do Iraq-style nation building, but do some stuff in the Middle East? Do you feel that we will be okay? Are we on the precipice of being not okay? Or how close are we now to the edge of really forcing almost a fairly fundamental rethinking of U.S. foreign policy just because the resources won't be there?
Yeah, it's a great question, Bill. I guess the way I would begin to think about answering it, as opposed to claiming I can really answer it, is to emphasize two countries. Senator Graham talked very appropriately about Iran, and we all know that that's a bigger wild card. I mean, there are big decisions looming, and it's not necessarily going to be a one-off thing where it's done a week after whatever happens initially occurs. The other thing is, where does our relationship with China go? And this is an obvious point, but it's a huge point, because I think the Obama administration's done a very nice job of rebalancing although just last week at Brookings, Hillary again said pivot, which I thought we were not saying anymore. But in any event,
she's on her way out, so she can say that.
well, she stayed at home today, right, to rest instead of going to Morocco, so she could be listening in, so we should be careful.
Okay.
But in any event, I think that China policy was handled well as a immediate corrective to what had developed over the previous years, which was, of course, a perception in the region that we were not as engaged, and that the Obama administration was a little bit young and inexperienced at first as well. And then they spent 2 years rebalancing, pivoting, and we've all watched that. And I think most people have respected the way it was done, but it doesn't necessarily constitute a long-term strategy. The big dilemma, the big choice, as we all know, Governor Romney, he didn't talk in a hostile way about China. He wanted a bigger Navy, largely, I think, to deal with the potential of China's rise. President Obama has been more hopeful that with modest changes in this rebalance, which are quite modest in military terms, that one can sort of remind people of our resoluteness and our firmness, and that will redirect China in the more productive directions we all hope it will continue to take. But it's a big if. So I guess rather than claim I can answer your question, I'll at least try to narrow down the uncertainty. It depends fundamentally on the U.S.-China relationship, and that would be my beginning of an answer to your question.
Oh, that's a good answer.
Well, I'm very concerned that the notion that we can rebalance to China, to Asia, but I just don't see the resources there today that give us the capability to do that. And I think China's growing, particularly naval power, with the objective of denying us access, should they decide to intervene somewhere in say, the South China Sea, an area that they consider within their sphere of influence, with territorial disputes, with Vietnam, with the Philippines, and with Japan. I think that I'm very concerned about our capability. I know on the Marine Corps side, the requirements for 34 amphibs, I think we're under 30 right now, in order to have the 2 brigade expeditionary forces. And so I'm just very concerned about not having that. There are areas I think what was mentioned today where we have a surplus capacity of, given the existing threats, say in ground forces, conventional ground forces. But I think there are areas that we have deficits in capability, and I think sea power is a key area.
You know, a friend of mine just got back from China and from a conference in China, and was struck by, this was a pretty honest discussion, closed conference, people from, the sort of government-approved think tanks and university departments there, and he was struck how there's sort of there are 3 scenarios with China. One is peaceful rise, everything pretty happy. 2 is more aggressive rise, need to be deterred, and that's what we've been talking about. He said he was struck by how many people were entertaining number 3, which was some form of crack-up or real regime crisis, which of course has its own, has its own foreign policy and national security implications. And there's a lot of history of regimes feeling they were under pressure, lashing out in various ways. And I think there's been such a focus on China's rise and checking that, which is reasonable, but less focus, it seems to be, on possible problems within China, which could lead to other great challenges, it seems to be, in the Pacific. So, for whatever it's worth, he was struck just at this actual meeting in Beijing. People, including Chinese participants, were talking about this. So, Pete?
Yeah, to pivot a little bit, to steal a word, I think assuming the indispensable nature of the U.S. role in the world, and I think if that breakup were to occur, it would reinforce that fact. We named this the Defend and Reform series precisely to say, hey, we defend freedom by reforming defense spending. You defend our ability and capability to protect and defend. We've talked a lot about reform. One of the questions we've frequently come back to is, how do you go about doing that? How do you go about reforming? I was doing some research in advance of this panel, and there was an article in Foreign Policy magazine that talked about, since 9/11, setting aside Iraq and Afghanistan spending, so additional war spending. We've spent $1 trillion more on our defense. The budget for the Navy went up 44%, but our fleet declined by 10%. The budget of the Air Force went up by 43%, and our air fleet, combat fleet, declined by 51%. Army funding doubled, or Army funding went up by 50%, and we only increased by 2 combat brigades. So, to me, it feels like we're adding here and not adding to the muscle. So how do you go about reforming it? We've proposed, is a Pentagon audit a good idea, which has never occurred within the Pentagon, and there's bipartisan legislation to pursue that. Is it the Pentagon proposing its own measures to do that? I guess as someone who's served and has seen that fat, acknowledging that the fat exists, how do you get at it? And how do you get at it in a meaningful way, I think, is something I'd love to explore.
We'll let all three of you comment on that, Mike, and then...
Well, it seems like too often when we hear from the Pentagon, they tend to be so institutional in terms of defending the status quo that they feel somehow obligated, that it's like a protection society with each other, that they're not going to, it's like ratting on this person over here that there's fat. Now, sometimes they do it. I think doing away with Joint Forces Command was obsolete. And despite the fact that you had members of Congress from Northern Virginia, cry that it's a jobs issue for them. But I think that, so I think it's not going to come. It's got to come from I think it has to come from the outside. One of the issues, let me just mention this quickly, and that is, with we need to demand more from our allies. They need to be force multipliers for us. And I look at our European allies, where we still have 79,000 troops. And when the Cold War has been over with since 1991, 4 U.S. Army Brigade combat teams still in Germany. I was in Germany in the Army, and during the early 1970s, where we had a mission where we went to the West German Czechoslovakian border and did patrols with the Warsaw Pact forces on the other side. There is no border. That border doesn't exist anymore, and there is no Warsaw Pact, and there is no Soviet Union. The only mission is beer, I think. And so, I think, and they're spending less than 2% of their economy on defense, most of them, and we're at 4.7. South Korea, we still have 28,000 troops in South Korea, none on the border, and they're spending 2.7% of their GDP. Again, we're at 4.7. And I think we need to demand more from our allies, and for them to be the force multipliers that they can be with us as partners, but we shouldn't be carrying them.
Yeah, I mean, good luck with that. I mean, it is shocking, but it needs to be factored into the discussion. I'm glad you mentioned it, because we really hadn't. I mean, when I was in the government in the first Bush administration, so 89 to 92, and I was vice president, chief of staff, and we were somewhat involved in the first Gulf War where you served. I mean, it was not, I remember looking, I had no professional role, obviously no expertise, but I was there in the meetings with the vice president, looking at the war plans and the allocation of forces, and we had serious forces from NATO allies, and they took a substantial part of the fighting, both on the ground and the air, and they were really part of, and there was enough parity, or at least close to parity and interoperability of the forces that you could actually do things. I really think that would not be the case today. And of course, we've seen that both in Iraq, which was less of a NATO effort, but even in Afghanistan, which was allegedly a NATO effort. I don't know if that means we can just throw up our hands and say, because Western Europe's gone in a certain direction, we have to, we certainly, I mean, God knows Secretaries of State and Defense have implored them to spend more. It doesn't seem like those trends are changing.
Well, and Bill, I would say it's not a question of can they, or do they want to? Can they? I mean, can you have? That's the question. Do they really have the capability, in light of the welfare states, in light of the expenditures they have in their fiscal situation, to actually project more? I can tell you, in Afghanistan, just haven't been there last year. They're almost, and God bless the Brits and the Aussies and the Canadians, a lot of which are doing heavy fighting. I acknowledge all of that, but more of an inhibitor than a someone contributing to the. It's nice to have 49 flags
with all the caveats.
With all the caveats that come with it, but I would say that we are on the road to that place where pretty soon you decide between a European style welfare state and an American style taxes, or American style the way we see ourselves. So. It's certainly a choice. They've made that choice. The question is, what choice?
They've made that choice, but we seem to be enabling them by virtue of having, again, 79,000 troops, many of which I would argue are. I mean, we have naval facilities there that are expeditionary forces that certainly project power, in the region and not simply in Europe. But there are forces that we need to raise. We can demonstrate our support by our allies. By doing joint military exercises, by doing rotational forces. Do we really need, I think we need to raise the question in this fiscal environment, that do we really need permanent bases, or are some of them obsolete historically?
Russell and Steve, you guys have been involved in defense reform efforts from inside and outside for quite a while. What do you think?
In line with this, the idea of us trying to encourage our allies to spend more is kind of a tough argument when we're saying, well, yeah, but we're going to spend less and we're going to raise our entitlements. We're looking at them and casting stones at their system the whole time we're moving in the same direction. It's a little hard to sit there and, I mean, when we weren't moving in that direction, it was hard to get them to move. Now, we're speaking with feet of clay. Our direction as a government and as a country is towards the European model, not drawing them away from it.
What about
and
within?
I'm not saying that's right. I think it's totally wrong, but that's where we're going.
What
So
about
while I agree with
within
you,
the
it's tough.
Pentagon? You guys have served and followed it very closely. I mean, how it's such a headache. I mean, everyone keeps agreeing there needs to be reform, and then it's very hard to reform. And any sense of, is it better, worse? Is there any one or two things that could actually be leveraged to really force some rethinking from within?
I'll let you make a more reasoned answer. I'll give the emotional one. All right. I spent 30 years in either the military or the government, and I spent 3.5 years in the private sector before I went to Heritage. And I have to tell you, and I told people this, I don't know why anyone would do business with the federal government other than you can make a lot of money. It is the most arcane, insane system. It costs companies more money to write proposals to get a federal contract than it does to execute most of them. And it's because there's this pile-on of years and years of laws and regulations and policies, all of which individually probably had some reason to be promulgated when they were, and now have made essentially not a web but a plug over the efficiency of the system. We have to dynamite that. That has to be changed. And it's going to be painful, and it's going to gore a lot of people's oxes. But if you really want to save money in the Pentagon, that's what you have to do, because it is stupid and wasteful. And it isn't just because there's, an Army doctor and a Navy doctor and an Air Force doctor. That's dumb enough. But it's when you're trying to buy, everybody in different uniforms, the body still works the same. It's when you're trying to buy things and you waste most of your money on the system before you ever get to the product. How the heck are you going to save any money? And those are based primarily in laws and regulations and policies that DOD can't change on their own.
Russell?
It's always a great question. There's a great study from the Harvard Business School in 1962 that finds massive cost growth in acquisition. The problem with all these suggestions is who's against them, right? Of course we should audit the Pentagon. Now, I think DOD pretty much knows where their money goes. Could we audit it? Sure. Do we have too many regulations? Sure. Is that the primary driver of our growing expense? I don't know. I think there's some systemic problems in there, and where observers keep going is the incentives within the Pentagon don't point the right way. Hey, I'm willing to stand up here in my suit and pontificate, but at the end of the day, it's our military that needs to provide the answer. We've gone out of our way to maintain the military advice to both the President and to the Congress, and we need to make sure that military advice is coming out and is coming out in a public way, and we're having a debate about what the best capability will best achieve the strategy the President has put forth.
Secretary of Defense Gates, former Secretary of Defense, warned us as he was leaving that, and this is one of the hard truths that we're going to have to take on. And he said that, and first of all, let me just say on the side, I think we are making inroads in acquisition reform. We got a long ways to go. But he said personnel costs, the trajectory of personnel costs, is going to eat into acquisition costs. And over time, we will become a hollow force. And so that is the most, so in a way, we're a microcosm of the problems in the overall budget in terms of how personnel costs are moving. And it is a fact of you could call it an entitlement issue. And so I think what we have to do is to look at reforming the retirement system, reforming the healthcare system. I think you can do it in a way to say, people currently in the system, we're going to leave them in the same system. But for new entrants into the military, maybe we'll have a bifurcated retirement system that will be part defined benefit, part defined contribution, and with a requirement that they're going to probably do more cost sharing on their health care when they retire. The earlier we obviously define a new policy, the better off we are in the long run. But I think that political reality is you're not going to change it for current people in the military, and nor should you. But I think certainly, again, I think that has to be a factor of reform.
Is that going to happen? I mean, you always didn't President Obama tentatively tiptoe into this a little bit in his budget? I can't remember, was this a year ago, or with TRICARE and all that?
It is in the defense authorization bills to create the military commission, or military retirement commission. So Congress has taken steps, and I'd remind everybody, Congress actually already did it once. They did it in 1986 and did reform the military retirement system. We then turned it off in 1999 just as the budget's going up. But Congress has done it before.
Mike, does this get you real savings, or just a little bit that you were talking about earlier?
Get you real savings. I guess I would put it in the context also of broader fiscal reform. If we can say that we're not just asking military retirees and veterans to make these sacrifices, but the whole country,
Sure. Right.
then it's a lot easier argument to win. And so, again, it links into the broader fiscal debate, not just because that's where you have to go for the real reduction in the deficit, but that's where you go for the political fairness that I think is essential for the argument to work.
Oh, but there's a separate issue. We have such an archaic retirement system where you say if you serve one day less than 20 years, you can wind up with nothing, and if you serve 20 years on the nose, it's 50% of your base pay, and then on. It doesn't really allow for somebody who serves in 10 years to be vested in anything and leaves. So it's not a fair system. So if it were part defined benefit, part defined contribution, and maybe with a vesting at a different level, then somebody could leave at a certain point and not feel obligated in doing something maybe that they didn't want to necessarily do, just to hit that 20-year mark.
Yeah, Russell.
To underscore the Congressman's point, as Steve said, we've seen this before. So I think and we've seen acquisition cost growth before, and we've seen personnel cost growth before. What's different this time? And the Congressman actually mentioned it. 1.4 million people in uniform. The Navy and Air Force are smaller than they were before we started the wars and before we started the defense upturn. The Army and Marine Corps did grow. All of those people above the FY17 levels, which is roughly comparable to the 90s levels, all of those costs are in war funding. There is no savings by returning to the late 90s personnel levels in the budget anymore. They're gone. That personnel savings have been 6 to 9% of where we get the savings in previous drawdowns. Where's that coming from this time? Heightened by how we pay our personnel underneath. It's, I think, the number one driver of why this time is different.
So say that again. So we already are anticipating the drawdowns as part of the war savings, in effect.
We've already anticipating the future end strength we're going to get to.
Right.
The president said we're going to draw down to about 490,000 in the Army and about 180,000 in the Marine Corps.
To get to that level. Not drawing down. To get to that level.
Right.
We're cutting that.
Every soldier and every Marine who is still serving above that level is paid for in the war budget, not in the base budget.
And I think an interesting question here is what are the pressure points? Where do you push in order to make it happen? And I think center to that is folks like the Congressman and others who have served, who can stand up and make a credible argument about reforming military retirement, about reforming, veterans benefit, any of these delivery systems that are so politically contentious, nearly impossible to talk about if you haven't served without being demagogued. I think that's why we're trying to do this. That's why it's good to see more and more young veterans getting elected to Congress coming around who can say, I saw it, I lived it, it's not going to work, and if we don't fix it, nothing changes. So, but I ask you, Congressman and others, is the main pressure point Congress? Is it the Secretary of Defense? Is it the White House? Where should groups seeking to advocate on this spend their time attempting to move the ball down the field on reform? Particular committees. That's
I think it's a great question. I think it's the veteran service organizations. that have tremendous influence in the Congress, particularly in the Armed Services Committee and the Veterans Committee. I think if you can influence, if any, there are members here to influence the Veteran Services organizations to sort of open up and to look at, alternatives to be open to change, I think that would have a tremendous impact on the Congress.
Would you also acknowledge that in some sense a lot of VSOs in Washington become interest organizations like every other interest organization?
Sure,
so that's something we've confronted too, is trying to new on the scene, trying to make a difference. How do we make that difference without becoming cozy and comfortable like many who are just asking for more as opposed to attempting to reform?
I think that obviously somebody transferred from the Marine Corps from the Army to the Marine Corps isn't probably has the highest test scores, but let me not to be critical of your son here. But I think you can write some of this stuff to where it's really beneficial. For instance, if you wrote, you've got it. Let's say you wrote a reform, and let's say it didn't impact current members of the military, and you're reforming the retirement system to say there's going to be part defined contribution like a 401k with a match, and part defined benefit, and there's going to be investing in such a period of time, and then you could be eligible, but you're not going to be eligible for it until maybe age 60. What would happen is, I think, you would then make it optional, make it mandatory for people entering the service, make it optional for people in the service. I think you'd have a lot of people in the service wanting to move from that defined benefit plan that says you got to be there for 20 years to get anything to move over to that defined contribution plan. And I think that will begin the process of reform and true cost savings in the retirement system, which again just is one element of the cost we need to look at. I really think that the biggest cost savings we could do is what I talked about earlier, and take a look at that 1.4 million people on active duty and really say, how many people really need to be on active duty versus the Guard and Reserve, where we maintain our capability, but we have an extraordinary cost savings in terms of personnel cost.
Let me, final word for Steve, and then I'll close.
Real quick, just to remind everybody, this is focused on defense reform. It's a necessary discussion. Defense needs to be reformed, but in the climate in this town, this is not going to solve the fiscal problem, right? This is not the biggest problem. We need to do it. We have a responsibility to do it, and we should do it correctly. But this is not going to fix the problem. We need to open up the lens completely and really take on all the entitlements, not just the ones somehow defined around.
Right, and this is a few tens of billions at maximum, and the problem is $1 trillion. So.
Right.
We're treading water in the Congress on this debt stuff. Because, you think about it, only 38% of our spending is discretionary, and half of that's defense. And quite frankly, we've got folks, including one in the White House, that doesn't seem to want to cut on the mandatory side of the equation, which is entitlement spending. 57% right now of all of our spending is entitlement spending, and that trajectory is really growing. And so you can't balance this on the back of the discretionary budget, particularly defense. Despite the fact, obviously, I'd be fighting for these reforms because I believe in them. The one thing that Congress says we have to, the Constitution says that we have to do, it grants Congress a lot of powers, but the one thing it says is maintain a common defense, and that's what we've got to do. And even when you look at this quadrennial review and how that's, been compromised to where it's about resources, where it's supposed to be about threats, and then you figure out how to match, the resources to counter the threats, and that's been reversed under this administration. And so we will never resolve this problem, never resolve it. Even if you do the sequestration this time around, it's not going to be resolved without entitlement reform. It won't happen.
Thank you, Mike. I want to thank this panel. Very interesting, genuinely interesting discussion, both on the defending defense side and on the reforming defense side. And maybe we can leave the stage here and have dessert and coffee while Senator Ayotte sums everything up and gives us words of wisdom from the Senate. So thank you all very much. It was really a terrific discussion. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Mike. Be well. Thank you. We'll be in touch. And so on the principle of ending with the best, not to put too much pressure on her, and not to insult all of our earlier panelists, and luckily Lindsey Graham has left already, so I can say this. It's a great pleasure and privilege to have Kelly out with us to make some remarks and take some questions. And she needs no introduction. Her bio's in the brochure, so I won't waste time with that, and I'll let her. She really took time out from a busy schedule in the Senate. Despite what Lindsey Graham says, some people in the Senate are actually doing some work, I think. So, so thank you very much, Kelly, for coming. And
thank you so much, Bill. Really appreciate what you do at the Weekly Standard and for hosting this event. I, of course, also want to thank Pete Hegseth for everything that he does with Concerned Veterans for America, and most of all of you who have served our country and continue to serve our country. God bless you, and thank you from the bottom of our hearts. I wanted to also echo what Representative Griffin just said up here. Let's put this into perspective of where we are with defense spending. So if you look at just what we're spending on the defense of our nation, he said something very important. What is it that we owe fundamentally to the American people? Of all the things that we do in the government, of all the things, if we looked at the Constitution, what is foremost? And that is to make sure that we defend our country and that America is safe. And so with all of the difficult challenges that we face right now, we can't lose sight of that. And we also can't lose sight of the fact that if you look at what we're spending on defense, roughly $631 billion, and that breaks down about $525 to the base defense budget, plus $88 billion, of course, for OCO funding, much of that going to support our men and women who are still serving us in Afghanistan as we stand here today. We could take all of it, right? And when you're running trillion-dollar deficits each year, it's not even get us halfway there, right? Barely gets us halfway there. So we have to put that in perspective when we think about the larger picture, fiscal picture of the country, given the responsibilities we have to the American people to make sure that our country is safe. And so one of the things, I'm going to talk about a number of things today, but I wanted to lead with the notion of, so how did we get here? I think we all understand, in part, how we got here, because clearly the debt crisis does threaten our country, our economic strength, and certainly our national security. And living beyond our means, the United States has, of course, accumulated $16 trillion in debt. And when I thought about running for the Senate, the thing that drove me to get off my couch and run for the Senate, which was no light decision in our family, was the debt. Because I've got 2 children. I clearly see, I'm sure, as every person sees in this room, and as Michael O'Hanlon, who is on your panel, in his book wrote, no great power can remain great if the economic underpinnings of its strength erode. And that's where we are right now with the debt. When we look at last year's base defense budget and war spending, the U.S. spent approximately 4.7% of its GDP on defense spending, which, if I were to put a chart up here that showed you the history of our defense spending from 1946 moving forward to where we are today, it's averaged about 7% of our GDP. Now, of course, there have been times leading up, but when we're in World War II, other conflicts, when it's been greater than others. But we are by no means right now, in terms of the percentage that we are spending on defense, as a percentage of our gross domestic product, spending an inordinate amount, if we were to look historically of what we're spending. And not only is defense spending actually somewhat at a lower range, if you looked at the average of a share of our federal budget, let's think for a minute of where we've been. In 1963, the defense spending accounted for 48% of all federal spending. Today, it's about 19% of our federal spending. In 1963, if we went back, entitlement and mandatory spending, entitlement programs in particular, thinking about Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, other mandatory spending was about 26% of federal spending. And today, it's close to 60% of federal spending. So we've seen a real shift of how we are spending our federal dollars. And if we do not take on the entitlement programs in terms of reforming them, two things happen. We can't get there from here. We can't get there if we take all the defense spending and we're to suddenly say that we're not going to spend anything on defending our nation in terms of addressing our debt. And those programs that many people in our country rely on, Medicare goes bankrupt in 2024, insolvent, and Social Security in 2033. In fact, one of the most enlightening things is that last year when the trustees of Medicare and Social Security issued their reports, Social Security insolvency was pegged at 2036, and we're now at 2033. So these programs, if we do not reform them, are going to eventually consume every federal dollar. And every choice that we want to make in terms of defending our nation, making sure that our men and women that serve have the support that they deserve and need for having made the ultimate sacrifice for us, many of them, and the sacrifices that their family have made. And where are we today in terms of the security around the world? Would anyone think here that we are in a position, if we look at what's happening around the world, that it is time for us to back off in terms of the strength of America, our capacity, what we need to do when we think about the challenges we face around the world right now? I don't think anyone here would say that this is a safe time around the world, that we suddenly could take a very large peace dividend, given what we see happening in many areas around the world, of course, in the Middle East, the investment that China is making, the challenges that we face in countries like Syria, of course, Iran marching towards the capability of having a nuclear weapon. We have, of course, the activity of al-Qaeda in Mali and other areas. So there are many challenges that we still face that could bring threats and do bring threats, including cyber threats, to this country. And so here's where we are. I'm going to talk about some of the reforms I think we can make to defense. I'm certainly not someone that thinks that we shouldn't reform defense spending. I absolutely think that those of us who care most deeply, who are here today, about making sure that we have a robust defense of this nation and protect our nation, are the ones that should come forward and offer constructive ways that we can reform defense spending. Because right now we're subject to a meat axe approach. Right now, sequestration is basically a meat axe where everything gets cut. We do everything insufficiently, and therefore we aren't making choices on how we handle things. So I want to applaud Concerned Veterans for America for some of the work that this group has been doing to identify areas within the Pentagon where we can do better, where we can save money. An example is, let's stop spending money on programs that are never going to come to fruition. The MEADS program, a weapons system that the Concerned Veterans for America has described, rightly so, as the quintessential Pentagon program that continues to get money but will never see the field of battle. And I couldn't agree more. Last year, in the Senate Armed Services Committee, we said this is the last funding, the end of appropriations for the MEADS program in 2012. And what did we get back? In the 2013 proposal from the administration, they asked for $400 million more for MEADS. This is outrageous. We have now another amendment in the Senate Armed Services in the Defense Authorization. It passed unanimously from committee, an amendment that I sponsored. And yet the administration has even threatened to veto the bill over the fact that we won't include $400 million for something we'll never see any tangible results from at a time when our country faces devastating cuts to our Department of Defense coming, of course, in January, already many of them being implemented. Audit. Listen, this is another area where Concerned Veterans for America have pushed. something that I care deeply about. In fact, last year's defense authorization, I was able to get in the Senate version an amendment that said, Secretary Panetta has said it's unacceptable that we can't fully audit the Pentagon. He has set a mark for 2014 that we would be able to do a statement of budgetary resources. Last year I put that in the law, asked to have an amendment. It was passed in the Senate version. It got dropped out in conference. It's there again this year. I'm hopeful that it'll be put in place because here's the thing. If we don't lay this out in the law, no matter what the Pentagon says, it is hard for us to hold the Pentagon accountable. So this is another area where how are we going to be able to make good decisions about defense spending if we don't have good information, if the Pentagon is not in a position to undergo an audit? And I want to commend the Concerned Veterans of America for that. And for all of the work that you're doing, we need your help. We need your help to find ways that we can do better at the Pentagon, that we can reform. Acquisition reform. Senator McCain and I have been working on that. There are provisions in the Defense Authorization Bill this year that will deal with cost contracts in the production phase of the contracting to limit those cost-plus contracts to very limited examples when you're producing a good after you've gone through the development phase of a weapons program. And so if you look at what we've done in acquisition, this is an area that has constantly cried out for reform. According to the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, over the last decade, the Department of Defense wasted $50 billion on programs that were canceled in the development phase. We have to do better, given the challenges and the fiscal challenges that we face as a nation. So I do believe there are ways we can do better at the Pentagon. And the Pentagon's ethos now has to include an ethos of not just what do we have to do, but also how much does it cost? And we need to have those conversations from the highest official, from our Secretary of Defense, down to every contracting officer in terms of the culture of the Pentagon and how people think of our taxpayer dollars, given the fiscal crisis that we face. That said, a couple of points. More than anything right now, we need presidential leadership. Our Department of Defense, as we look at where we are, we look at the debt ceiling agreement that we reached, the super committee failing to come up with $1.2 trillion in savings, that the Department of Defense faces sequestration. We're already reducing defense spending about $487 billion over the next 10 years. A lot of tough choices, by the way, in that $487 billion reduction. We're going to keep our naval fleet at 285, 72,000 reduction from the Army and end strength, 20,000 reduction in the Marine Corps. Some of that, of course, was going to happen as we draw down in Afghanistan, as we've gotten out of Iraq. But a lot of tough choices. But coming in January, another $500 billion across the board. Not discriminate, not choices made in a budgeting process where we're prioritizing, what we need to do based on our national security needs, based on the strategy for our country to make sure that our country is safe. And so at this time, I really hope when we're looking at this fiscal cliff, we're looking at the issue of the tax rates for the country, that we don't lose sight of the sequestration as it impacts our Department of Defense. And there are ideas out there. I'm the co-sponsor of a bill that through federal work attrition and also a federal pay freeze, we could get enough to cover it for a year on both sides. Buck McKeon has a bill in the House that's similar. So there are ideas out there on how we could address sequestration and come up with alternative savings. But we need leadership on this issue, and we can't just roll over and think that sequestration is the right direction for our country to take. I think that there probably is some additional savings we could find from defense in responsible ways, but this across-the-board meat-axe approach, just to put one issue on the table here, think about our naval fleet. Our naval fleet, many think, should be up at 313. Some experts that have looked at that. In fact, I want to know from our Navy what we really need, and so one of the amendments I have in the defense authorization this year is have them actually tell us how many ships do you need, particularly given our focus on the Asia-Pacific region right now. And so if sequestration goes into impact, what we've been told by the Navy, it's not just maintaining your fleet at 285, that we could go down to 230 or 235 in terms of our naval fleet. So that's just one area when we think about the challenges we face right now in the world, the threats that still remain, the investment from China in their Navy. That's just one aspect of our protection and our safety around the world. So my hope, here's what I'm going to leave you with, my hope. It's a challenging time in Washington. We've got tax rates, we've got extenders, we've got sequestration, we've got an extension of FISA, we've got a lot on our plate right now. My hope is that, A, we will finally get some presidential leadership. I haven't yet seen it, unfortunately. There's been so much focus on this tax rate issue that, frankly, have you heard anyone talking about sequestration lately? Not a lot of it. We finally need to do a large debt deal. And in my view, this is my opinion, Kelly Ayotte, tax reform, entitlement reform, we should address sequestration to make sure that we don't create a national security crisis on top of our debt crisis. There may be additional savings we can find from defense, but we by no means can find $500 billion and still look each other and say that we can meet the threats to our country and to the world that could threaten America or our allies. So we've got to do it now. I remain hopeful despite the acrimony in Washington. And listen, if we could just show one iota of the courage that many of you have shown in this room in terms of addressing our debt crisis, then I have great hope for America. And veterans are going to lead the way on this. You want to know what the role of Concerned Veterans for America should be? And for veterans throughout this country, like my husband, he looks at me and he says, guys, just do it. Make a decision. Show some courage. I know that my constituents are not going to like every single decision I make if we do a large debt deal that actually changes the trajectory of where we are going right now as a country instead of this way, that protects our military, makes sure that America remains strong. But if I could give everyone a Christmas gift around here or a Hanukkah gift, it would be courage. And you all have shown that through your service to our nation, and it's time for us to take some lessons from you in terms of the courage that we need around here to get some things done for our country and to finally get our country on the right track. And here's the good news. Nothing can stop this country. We are one major deficit deal away from the next century really being the American century, and nothing can stop us. And I don't believe in any of this philosophy that the next century won't be an American century and that the next century won't be America as the strongest country in the world. It's all within our power here, so urge us to get something done. Thank you.
Well, let me thank Senator Ayotte. You see why she deserves the reputation she's built in just 2 years here as one of our most thoughtful and well-respected members of Congress, senators, and not only on national security issues, but especially on those issues. So thank you for that eloquent and really statesmanlike, I would say, presentation. I think we promised we would let you go at 2 o'clock, and it's about 3 minutes to 2 o'clock, so I'm going to ask Pete Hegseth to come up and just close out this lunch, which I will say, knowing much less about this than most people in this room, have found quite interesting and illuminating discussion, and I think we wish maybe more discussions in Washington could be as genuinely an attempt to solve the problems as opposed to posturing. I wish Senator Ayotte very good luck in her gifting of courage to other members of Congress and to members of the executive branch, and I hope maybe she'll go around and give out these gifts for the next 2 weeks, and everything will be changed when we come back after the new year. But let me ask Pete to come up and close this, and thank you all on behalf of the Weekly Standard as a co-sponsor of this for coming too.
Two seconds. Again, I thank you for coming. I too wish this town a heavy dose of courage. It's going to require it. When I sat there, when she talked about $500 billion
and the scope, the size of the defense budget, and then you look at the annual deficits we're running of trillions. The scope of the problem is massive, which should underscore the heavy hearts I hope we all leave here with, understanding the scope of the problem, the need to change it, and to bring about the kind of reform necessary to make the next century an American century. I do not get 5% of Michael O'Hanlon's book proceeds, but I should, because if you haven't read his book, The Wounded Giant, you should. It talks about the threat of debt. It talks about declining countries and why they decline because of their debt burden. Ultimately, our fiscal house, without putting our fiscal house in order, without getting our economy back on track, our ability to project military power and defend our interests around the world will have to be curtailed. So I recommend this as a read. I hope you'll take a look at the report we produced, and we look forward to locking arms with you. I made a comment about VSOs up here. I want to clarify, we want to work with the American Legion, with the VFW, groups in this room and in this Capitol that have been doing yeoman's work on stuff like this for years. We want to re-energize the debate, re-energize the discussion, bring the veterans' voice to the table that can credibly talk about how we clean our own house so that Washington can help get its fiscal house in order and make that next century an American century the way it should be. So we're honored to have you here. We've stolen your information, so we will continue to be in touch with you. And we hope you let your friends and fellow veterans know about Concerned Vets for America and charge forward with us boldly into the future. Thank you very much for being here.